I lit the candle every night at the same hour, watching the flame bend toward the window like it was listening. Some habits start as prayer and turn into proof of survival. I never expected the night someone else would know why that candle was there. I lived alone in a narrow house at the edge of town, where the streetlights dimmed early and winter stayed longer than it should. My daughter had been gone for years, not lost in the way newspapers mean, but missing in the way silence grows heavy. The candle was my quiet promise to remember, and the nights were my only witnesses. The light outside always faded before I was ready. It slipped away quietly, the way things do when no one is watching. I would stand at the window, fingers resting on the sill, and wait for that last thin line of gold to disappear from the street. Only then would I reach for the candle. It sat on the small table beside the window, plain and white, the glass cloudy from years of smoke. I struck the match. The sound was soft, almost shy. For a moment, the flame trembled like it was deciding whether to stay. Then it settled. Every night the same. The kettle hadn't whistled yet, but I could already feel the house listening. Old houses do that. They lean in when routines repeat. The floorboards beneath my feet held the day's warmth, and the walls gave back the quiet I put into them. I placed the candle on the windowsill, nudging it into the same faint circle it had worn into the paint over time. I didn't look outside right away. I never did. There was a time when evenings felt full. Voices, dishes clinking, a radio humming somewhere in the background. Now, evenings arrived slowly, like guests who weren't sure they were welcome. The candle helped, gave the hours shape. Without it, time spread out too wide and I got lost inside it. I told myself it was just a habit. People have worse ones. Some drank. Some talked too much. Some filled their houses with noise so they wouldn't have to hear themselves think. I lit a candle. That was all. From the street, it must have looked ordinary. Just another light in another window. Neighbors passed with grocery bags, children trailing behind them, coats half-zipped, laughter rising and falling. Cars slowed at the corner and moved on. Seasons shifted without asking my permission. Snow gathered along the curb in winter. Dust clung to the air in summer. Through it all the flame stayed. I never marked anniversaries anymore. Dates had sharp edges. They cut if you held them too long. Instead I marked evenings. One flame for one night. That felt safer. The window glass was cool against my knuckles. Sometimes my reflection hovered there, faint and distorted, layered over the street outside. I looked older in that glass than I felt. Or maybe I felt older than I wanted to admit. The flame softened my face, erased some of the lines. Fire is kind that way. It lies gently. I didn't pray. Not the way people expect. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't make promises. The candle wasn't about hope. Hope reaches forward. This was different. This was staying. I remembered the first night I lit it. I hadn't planned to. The house had been too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears until they ring. I'd found the candle in the back of a cupboard, still wrapped in paper. Someone had given it to me years earlier. I couldn't remember who. I lit it because my hands needed something to do. That night, I left it burning longer than I should have. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the flame bend and straighten like breathing. When it finally burned down, the room felt colder than before. The next evening I lit another. And then another. No one ever asked about it. People don't ask about quiet things. They ask about noise. About what's broken in obvious ways. The candle was neat. Contained. Easy to overlook. When neighbors stopped by, I made sure the curtain stayed half-drawn. Not closed, just enough. I didn't want questions. Questions have a way of opening doors you've nailed shut on purpose. Sometimes, though, I imagined someone noticing. A stranger slowing on the sidewalk. A familiar face tilting their head, puzzled. I imagined the words forming on their lips. Why do you keep that light on every night? I never practiced an answer. There wasn't one that fit cleanly. You can't explain absence without sounding like you're asking for pity. And I wasn't. Pity is loud. This was quiet. The flame flickered when a draft slipped through the frame. I reached out, steadying the glass without thinking. My hand hovered there, palm warm, the heat seeping into my skin. Fire remembers touch. It leaves marks, even when you pull away in time. Outside, a bus sighed to a stop and moved on. Somewhere down the block, a door slammed. Life continued at a distance, careful not to brush up against me. I was grateful for that. I used to watch the street until the candle burned low. Lately I found myself watching the flame instead. It leaned toward the window, toward the dark. As if it knew something I didn't. As if it was waiting. I told myself I would stop someday. That one evening I would forget. Or decide it didn't matter anymore. People say forgetting is healing. I wasn't sure I believed them. When the candle finally sputtered, I pinched the wick between two fingers, ignoring the sting. The smoke curled upward, thin and gray, clinging to the air before fading. The room dimmed, but it didn't go dark. Streetlights spilled in, pale and distant. I stayed there a moment longer, hand resting on the sill where the glass was still warm. The circle in the paint had grown darker over the years, a quiet record of all those nights. Proof, if anyone ever needed it, that I had been here. That I had waited. As I turned away, I felt it again, that small, unspoken fear. Not of the dark, but of being seen. Of someone finally asking why. Because I wasn't sure what would happen if I had to say her name out loud. The house always made its sounds at night. Not loud ones, small ones. A sigh in the walls. A slow creak beneath the floor, like someone shifting their weight after standing too long. I learned to tell the difference between settling wood and memory. They don't sound the same. Some nights, I would pause at the bottom of the stairs and wait. The air felt thicker there, holding on to the day. I could hear the clock in the kitchen counting seconds I wasn't using. The house leaned inward, as if it expected me to speak first. I didn't turn on many lights. One lamp in the living room was enough. Its shade cast a soft oval on the wall, stopping just short of the framed photographs. I kept those turned face down now. Not because they hurt. 'Cause they watched. The frames still held their weight. I dusted them anyway, careful, slow, my cloth moving around edges I could trace with my eyes closed. I remembered where every picture used to be. Her smile caught mid-laugh. Her hair pulled back badly, the way she always did when she was in a hurry. I didn't need to see them to know they were there. The stairs complained when I climbed them. Third step from the bottom. Always the loudest. She used to skip it, laughing when it creaked anyway. Now I stepped on it deliberately. Some things shouldn't be avoided. At the top of the stairs, the hallway narrowed, the ceiling lowering just enough to make you feel watched. Her door stood halfway down, closed. Stayed that way. I never locked it. Locks feel like decisions. I wasn't ready for that. Her room smelled faintly of dust and something softer beneath it. Fabric. Paper. The curtains stayed drawn, but light found its way in through the edges, thin and gray. I stood in the doorway and didn't cross the threshold. The bedspread was smooth. Too smooth. I'd straightened it years ago and never touched it again. The indent where she used to sit on the edge had long since faded, but my eyes still went there. The dresser held nothing but air now. Empty drawers make a particular sound when you pull them out. Hollow, almost offended. Sometimes I spoke to the room. Not often. Just enough to hear my voice land somewhere. I'm still here, I'd say. Or, it's cold tonight. Once I said her name without meaning to. The sound startled me. It echoed too clearly, like the room had been waiting for it. The house answered in its own way. Pop in the radiator. A distant knock from somewhere deep in the walls. I stood still, listening, my hand gripping the doorframe until my fingers ached. Downstairs, the living room carried more of me in it. My chair by the window. The worn arm where my hand rested every evening. The rug with a corner that never lay flat. The house knew my habits better than anyone else ever had. I spoke aloud there too. Short sentences. Fragments. Do you remember? I didn't mean to. I thought there would be more time. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Silence has weight when you give it something to hold. Sometimes I felt foolish, talking to empty rooms like they could answer back. But the house had heard everything before. Arguments, laughter, doors closing too hard, promises made while standing in doorways. If walls could forget, this one hadn't learned how. The photographs stayed face down because I didn't want their eyes on me when I spoke. It's easier to confess when no one is looking. One evening, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint mark on the wall near her door. Just above where her shoulder might have brushed as she passed. Could have been nothing. Shadow. A trick of the light. But I stood there a long time staring at it. My fingers hovered inches away, then touched the wall. Paint was cool, and changed. Whatever had been there was gone now. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. The house creaked again, low and slow. Not the usual settling. Something deeper. I felt it under my feet, a vibration more than a sound. "Is that you?" I asked quietly. The question surprised me. I hadn't planned it. Nothing answered. And yet, the silence felt fuller than before. As if the house had inhaled and was holding its breath. I moved through the rooms more slowly after that. Listening harder. Not for voices. For gaps. For places where sound should have been and wasn't. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the counter where she used to sit, swinging her legs, talking while I cooked. There was a small chip in the edge where she'd dropped a mug once. I meant to fix it. I never did. "Careful," I whispered, the word slipping out on its own. The house answered with the soft hum of the refrigerator, steady and patient. That night, I didn't turn the photographs back down right away. I stood in front of one frame, fingers resting on the edge. I didn't flip it. I just acknowledged it. Like greeting someone through a closed door. The floor creaked behind me. I turned, heart quickening for no good reason. The hallway was empty. Course it was. Still the feeling stayed. That the house knew something I didn't. That it had seen moments I had missed. Heard words spoken when I wasn't there to hear them. When I finally sat in my chair by the window, the candle's glass was still warm from earlier. The flame leaned slightly, reacting to a draft I couldn't feel. I watched it steady and waiting. "I'm listening," I said, so softly I barely heard myself. The house did not speak. But it creaked again, slow and deliberate, like a reply given in a language I was only beginning to understand. I stayed there until the candle burned low, wondering if memory lived in walls the way it lived in people. And if so, what else this house might be holding back from me. The knock was soft. Too soft for someone to demand attention. Yet deliberate. It pressed into the night in a way that made the windows shiver. I was sitting by the candle, the flame bending toward the glass when I heard it. I froze, listening to the pause that followed, long enough to make the heartbeat in my chest feel loud. The wind rattled the edges of the porch roof. Cold damp. It smelled like wet asphalt and something older I couldn't place. I didn't move immediately. I didn't want to. After a moment I stood. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I reached for the door, my hand brushing against the cold wood. Smooth and familiar. The latch clicked when I lifted it. Outside the man waited. His coat was dark, soaked at the hem. He lowered his head as if the night itself had demanded it. I couldn't see much of his face at first, only the shadowed outline of a jaw, a quiet stiffness in his shoulders. Then he lifted his gaze slightly, careful, cautious, like stepping into a memory. "Mrs." he said. His voice was rough, careful, testing the sound of my name. "Mrs. Harper." I blinked. The air shifted in a way I couldn't describe. How could someone know my name? I opened the door a little wider. The porch light caught his coat, wet streaks running down the fabric. He nodded slightly. "My daughter," he whispered next. The words fell like a stone into water. I felt the ripples in the silence of the night. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a claim. Just her name. Time slowed. The candlelight flickered against the window behind me. I could hear my own breath, sharp and uneven. The wind carried a damp chill through the narrow space between us. He didn't raise his eyes fully, not yet. He only said her name again, softly, reverently. I stepped back. The doorframe felt suddenly too thin to hold me. I wanted to ask who he was, why he knew, but the words caught in my throat. What do you say to someone who speaks a name you thought only the walls remembered? He cleared his throat. The sound was small, careful. I knew her once, he said finally, almost under his breath. I mean he stopped. His hands fidgeted in his coat pockets. He looked vulnerable in the night, a shadow of someone I didn't know, yet somehow had known my daughter. I wanted to slam the door. I wanted to tell him he had no right to speak her name, no right to cross the threshold of our lives. But something in his posture, in the hesitation and the cold in his coat, made me pause. The night stretched between us, thick and waiting. I saw the faint tremble in his hands. And I saw her there, in memory, smaller than the dark, laughing once at something I couldn't hear. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I only let him stand there. Where did you find her? I finally asked, barely above a whisper. His head lowered again. He shook it. I didn't, he said. His voice trailed. I can't tell you everything. Not yet. The words hit the air and stayed there. Silent, heavy, impossible to move past. I didn't understand. I didn't want to, yet I needed to. The cold was creeping through my slippers, up my legs into my chest. But I stayed rooted. He shifted 1 foot forward, hesitant. I just needed to know she's safe, he said. The wind moved around us, pushing raindrops from the porch roof to the floor. His eyes lifted briefly, meeting mine. They were tired. Not angry. Not demanding. Tired. I felt something crack inside me. Not completely, not loudly. Just a small, quiet fissure like ice under snow. I wanted to close the door, but I also wanted to listen. Something in the air told me this man wasn't a threat. But he carried a weight I didn't understand. I don't know why you're here, I said. The words sounded brittle, small against the night. He nodded again. I know, he said. I know. That's why I'm here. I looked past him, into the darkened street. The lamps flickered, yellow and wavering, casting half-formed shadows across the sidewalk. Somewhere down the block, a car rolled slowly, tires hissing on wet asphalt. The world continued beyond our small porch, indifferent to the storm of memories that had gathered here. His coat smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet earth. I noticed the small details now. The threadbare cuffs, the worn edges, the way his hands barely held themselves steady. Every movement careful, every gesture cautious. He was carrying something invisible. And it was heavier than the night. He paused. He drew a breath like he was holding a lifetime in his chest. My name is Thomas, he said finally. I knew her. When she was small. Before everything changed. My heart tightened. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. The air was already heavy with understanding. And questions that had no answers yet. I stepped aside, silent, letting him come closer to the door. Not fully in. But close enough that the night could carry our unspoken words. He looked down at his boots, then at me, then back at the dark street beyond. And I realized. The world outside this house had carried her farther than I ever had. The wind rustled leaves along the curb. The night smelled of rain and damp wood. The candle behind me leaned toward the window. Its small flame trembled as if it too had recognized the name. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I could say anything. All I knew was that someone out there remembered her too. Someone beyond the walls and photographs. Someone who knew the sound of her laughter. The shape of her small hands. Thomas swallowed. He said again. And then he stopped. The pause stretched, holding something I couldn't name. I wanted to close the door. I wanted to slam it. I wanted to run back to my candle and the comfort of its waiting flame. But I stayed. And for the first time in years, I felt the air shift around the house. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the walls. Something had entered the space that had always been mine alone. And it was her name. spoken softly in the dark, by a stranger who shouldn't have known it, but did. I let the door hang open a little longer. The night held us both. The street held its breath. And I wondered, how many more truths waited outside my door, hidden in shadows I'd been too careful to notice. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and the night returned to its place around us. I didn't step forward. I didn't invite him in. The porch light spilled over his coat, highlighting damp streaks at the hem, but left his face mostly in shadow. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself as if the night itself could push him back. The candle behind me flickered, and for a moment, its small flame seemed to bend toward him, curious. We stayed there, neither of us moving, as though the seconds themselves had thickened into something almost solid. The air between us was cold, damp with the promise of rain. I could hear the faint drip from the eaves, a slow tap-tap that marked time differently than a clock. I shifted my weight, one foot brushing the worn doormat. The smell of wet wood and faint smoke hung low, settling in my clothes and hair. Inside, the house waited, quiet but patient. I sensed its presence, the walls leaning in slightly, listening. I wanted to break the silence, but my voice caught somewhere between caution and fear. I noticed how he looked past me, toward the candle on the windowsill. Not at the flame exactly, but through it, like it revealed something he could see only when no one else was looking. Recognition softened his eyes, just a hint, and the line of his jaw relaxed for the briefest instant. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't judgment. It was something deeper, something like understanding. I wondered if he felt the weight I carried, or if the candle meant something entirely different to him. His hands stayed in his pockets, fingers curling and uncurling. I watched the subtle rhythm, the way he rocked slightly, as if shifting his weight would anchor him. He didn't speak. I didn't either. The silence stretched, long and deliberate. Neither of us needed to ask the obvious questions. They hovered there anyway, unsaid, filling the space with tension and unacknowledged grief. I could feel the small pulse of the candlelight across my back, warm against the chill of the night. The glass had fingerprints on it, my own smudges from earlier, and I reached out to smooth them without thinking. The motion was tiny, almost imperceptible, but it felt necessary, like marking my claim on the light. He noticed, I think. Or maybe he only sensed the care behind it. He didn't comment. He didn't move closer. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of wet leaves from the street. A car hummed by, tires whispering against asphalt. Somewhere a dog barked, low and distant. Everything beyond the porch seemed removed, irrelevant to the space we shared. Here, only the candle and the silence mattered. Here, the air was heavy with questions neither of us dared speak. I thought about closing the door. Thought about turning away and letting the night reclaim its distance. But something in the tilt of his head, the quiet focus of his eyes, made me hesitate. He wasn't threatening. He was waiting. And waiting meant something. He looked down at the doormat, then back toward the candle. Recognition lingered in his gaze, subtle but undeniable. It was not the recognition of a stranger noticing a habit. It was something closer, something personal. I wanted to ask him what he saw in the flame, but the words felt heavy in my mouth. I swallowed instead, letting the silence hold them for me. The porch creaked under my subtle shift, a soft sound that seemed to echo more than it should. He flinched almost imperceptibly. I felt the weight of years of absence pressing between us. Every breath I took seemed too loud, every pause a question answered only by the dark. I thought of her then, standing somewhere in memory, small and laughing, unaware of the consequences of her absence. I wondered if he had seen her like that. The thought caught me off guard, a small tightening in my chest. He turned slightly, shifting his weight, and I realized he might be carrying the same image, or a similar one, hidden beneath the careful folds of his coat. Time bent around us. Minutes stretched, dragging behind them a history neither of us had claimed aloud. I could feel the doorframe beneath my hand, solid and grounding. I could feel the cold wind nipping at the edges of my coat, my hair, my skin. The candle's flame shivered again, as if nudged by the pause, and I leaned toward it instinctively, drawing comfort from its glow. He exhaled slowly, a quiet sound that barely disturbed the night. Something shifted in him, subtle but present. I could see it in the lift of his shoulders, the small tilting of his head. It was almost imperceptible, almost gone if you blinked. And yet I noticed, because silence teaches you to notice the smallest changes. For a long moment we stayed like that, neither inviting nor retreating, just existing in the same narrow circle of light and shadow. I could feel the history pressing in from every direction, the absence, the memory, the unspoken truths. And I realized something I hadn't dared consider. The candle wasn't just mine. It belonged to the space between us now, to the pause, to the waiting. Finally I spoke, not with words that needed answers, only enough to fill the silence. "I don't know what you want," I said softly. He nodded, acknowledging the truth of it without replying. The air seemed to exhale around us, carrying the weight of unasked questions into the dark. He lifted his eyes to the candle again, and I understood in that small moment that the pause had done something we couldn't have done with words alone. It had created a bridge, a fragile, tentative space where recognition could exist without explanation, where questions could linger, waiting to be met on their own time. The wind picked up, rattling the edges of the porch roof. Drops of rain kissed the wood, faint and cold. I felt the chill through my slippers, through the thin socks I'd forgotten to replace. The night was reclaiming its edge. And still he didn't leave. He didn't cross the threshold. He simply stood there waiting and looking toward the light I had tended alone for so long. I watched the candle flicker, small and steady. Its glow reached him, just enough to illuminate the recognition in his eyes. And in that quiet moment, I realized something I hadn't before. The long pause had become something I couldn't walk away from. Not yet. We remained there. Two figures in the dark, separated by a door, yet connected by the light that refused to go out. And I wondered, what would happen if the pause finally ended? The door closed behind us with a muted click. The wind rustled the trees outside, scattering loose leaves across the porch. Inside, the house smelled faintly of candle wax and old wood, the familiar scent pressing in around me. I didn't offer him a seat at first. I let him stand near the doorway, coat damp, shoulders tense. The candle on the windowsill flickered softly, casting long shadows across the walls. His eyes traced the light as though it were a map, and I felt the pause between us stretch, thick and deliberate. I watched him carefully. The room felt different with another person in it, even a stranger. Every floorboard groan, every whisper of wind, carried more meaning than usual. I could see the quiet weight he carried, the way his boots left faint marks on the rug. He didn't speak at first, just exhaled slowly, letting the silence fill in the spaces where words might have gone. I wondered if he was sizing me up, or if he too was waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. The clock in the hallway ticked quietly, too loud in contrast to his stillness. I felt the familiar pull of memory around me, the way rooms hold on to moments long after they've passed. Her laughter, once echoing down these halls, felt like it had been folded into the walls. I could almost hear it in the quiet flicker of the candle, and I realized that he had come here carrying the same weight, though I didn't yet know why. Finally he spoke. Not in sentences, not complete ones, but fragments. We crossed paths once, he said, voice low, careful, deliberate. His eyes flicked down to his hands. They trembled slightly, fingers brushing against each other, almost as if they couldn't decide how to behave. I didn't interrupt. I let the silence hold him, knowing that some things need space before they can be spoken. He shifted his weight, glanced briefly at the candle, then back at me. We shared a road, he said. Briefly. By chance. It wasn't long. But I remember. His voice was steady, almost clinical in its pacing, but there was a tremor beneath it I couldn't ignore. I watched his hands. Every subtle movement seemed to carry meaning. The curl of his fingers, the way he traced an invisible line across his palm. I wondered if he was tracing her memory there, in silence. He paused, gathering words that didn't seem to want to come. They laughed, he said finally. Her laugh, he said, as if just saying it aloud might make it real. The tremor in his hands grew. I could see it. I could feel it. The room held its breath alongside us. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I didn't want to. There's a difference between hearing a story and demanding it. I let the fragments land where they would, like small stones dropped into a quiet pond. Ripples formed, and I felt them in the hollow spaces inside myself that had long been empty. "Her joy," he murmured, voice barely above the candle's flicker. I remember it. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was something heavier. Something that hung between words and silence. Guilt. Maybe. Reverence. Perhaps. Or simply memory. I took a step closer, drawn by the gravity of it, though I didn't move to touch him or even speak. The air between us was thick with the unspoken. Each pause, each breath, made the room feel smaller, more intimate. The house itself seemed to lean in, listening. The floorboards groaned beneath us, reminding us that we were not alone. His eyes shifted to the window, to the candle, to the shadows it cast along the walls. They smiled at the same things I smiled at, he said. And they didn't know me. Not really. His voice broke, not in volume, but in the subtle tremor that revealed too much. I watched his lips, his hands, his eyes. Everything about him spoke of quiet confession, of a truth he could barely bear to carry alone. I thought about her then, the memory of her small hands in mine, the curve of her laugh, the way she looked at the world without fear. Did he see her the way I had? Or only fragments like shards caught in his memory? I didn't ask. I didn't need to. The fragments he offered were enough. Heavy enough to fill the room. He swallowed, and I could hear the small hitch of air. I didn't know what to do, he said finally. Not then. Not ever. The words were simple, but the weight behind them pressed against the silence like a tide. I could feel it in the way the candle trembled in its glass, the way the shadows shifted on the walls. I reached for the chair nearest the window, settling slowly into its worn arms. He didn't move. He stayed near the doorway, hands folded in front of him, shoulders taut. And I realized that he was not asking for forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe never. Time stretched between us again. I thought of all the nights I had lit candles alone, speaking into the quiet, hoping that memory could hold some shape. And now, someone else had come, carrying pieces of the same memories, carefully, gently, trembling in their hands. The candlelight pooled between us, small and steady, bridging the silence. For the first time in years, I felt a measure of understanding pass through the room. He inhaled slowly, letting the air fill his chest. I just wanted you to know, he said softly, almost to himself. Not to hurt. Not to interfere. The words hovered. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. The weight of what he carried spoke more than words could. I watched him then, really watched. The lines in his face, the careful tilt of his head, the way his hands shifted subtly, all told a story I wasn't sure I could name. But I understood it in some small, quiet way. It was the story of memory, of chance encounters, of lives briefly intertwined and never fully letting go. The wind rattled the edges of the windowpane. Rain tapped faintly against the glass. The candle flickered again, leaning toward him as though it too recognized the truth in his voice. I felt the air shift, heavier now, as if the house itself had taken in his story, weighed it, and held it alongside mine. I didn't speak. I only nodded slightly, letting the room hold the fragile connection between us. He exhaled slowly, one shoulder dropping as if a small piece of the burden had been released. The candle continued to glow, steady but fragile. And I realized that sometimes, stories need to be told slowly, in fragments, in quiet spaces where memory and presence can coexist. We stayed that way for a long moment. Two figures in a small room, connected by fragments of memory and the fragile light of a single candle. And I understood finally that the telling itself had weight. And that weight could heal, if only gently, slowly, without forcing closure. He didn't move to leave. I didn't invite him to stay. We simply existed in the same small circle of light, letting the fragments settle. The air was heavy with unspoken truths, and yet, for the first time, it felt lighter. Because memory, carried carefully, can become something that binds rather than breaks. I watched his hands tremble one last time as he took a breath and shifted slightly. And I realized that the pause between words, the long moments where nothing is said, can sometimes speak louder than any story fully told. The candle flickered again, small and patient, and I wondered what the next fragment would be. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and old paper. Outside, the wind rattled the edges of the windowpane, carrying the faint bite of winter with it. I traced the rim of my teacup, watching the small swirl of steam rise toward the ceiling. It reminded me of her. Small, fleeting, impossible to hold. The candle flickered on the windowsill, bending toward the cold, and for a moment, I felt the room contract around the memory. Her laugh, her sighs, the quiet snap of her footsteps on snow from years ago. They all returned, delicate as frost on glass. The winter we shared last felt like another life. The streets had been white, soft underfoot, but somehow distant, cold in ways neither of us spoke of. We had argued over small things. Tea left a steep too long, a coat hung carelessly, words spoken in passing. I remember the way she would walk ahead, shoulders tense, and I would follow, thinking time would stretch endlessly before us. I thought I had more chances. I thought distance was a pause, a quiet place we could return from. Had I been mistaken? Had the silence I mistook for peace been something else entirely? I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the candle, on the shadows it cast. He spoke slowly, deliberately, letting his words land like snowflakes on untouched ground. The last winter, he said softly. She seemed far even then. I felt the ache in my chest tighten. The way he said it mirrored the truth I had tried to bury. The sense that something was slipping away before I could grasp it. I watched his hands, knuckles pale, fingers curling and uncurling, trembling at the memory he carried. He paused, as if collecting the fragments of time that belonged to both of us. I remember the snow lining the streets, he continued. The way it muffled the world. How it made her voice sound distant, even when she was standing beside me. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the image return unbidden. Her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, red against the white streets, and the quiet tension in the space between us. I had been angry then. Over things too small to matter, things I now wished I could undo. I could feel the warmth of the candle behind me, but it did little to reach the chill that had settled over the memory. I wondered if she had felt the same cold, the same weight pressing in, or if it had been mine alone. He shifted slightly, a faint creak of the floorboard announcing the movement. I didn't know then, he said, voice low, hesitant, that it would be the last winter, that she would leave. The word left the air fragile and suspended, more impactful in its quiet than it could ever be in force. The teacup in my hand trembled slightly. I set it down, letting the sound of porcelain against wood punctuate the silence. I remembered our voices raised, not in anger, but in frustration. Small sharp edges cutting at each other, each believing the other had more patience than they truly did. I had believed time would give us answers. I had believed distance was only temporary. And yet, here we were years later, retracing footsteps I could not step back upon. He inhaled slowly, letting the cold air fill his lungs. The arguments, they weren't about the things themselves, he said. They were about the spaces between. The things left unsaid. I felt a shiver, not from the cold but from the weight of truth. Had I mistaken her quiet for indifference? Had I misread every small sign of her distance as reassurance? I watched him closely, noting how even now, speaking of that winter made him tremble. The memory had a gravity that none of our present could diminish. He lifted his gaze to the window, to the snow that might have once lined the streets outside this house. It was only a shadow now, but it carried the same quiet beauty and cold inevitability. "I remember thinking," he whispered almost to himself, "that she would come back, that she had to come back." And I realized that I had believed the same. We had both stood at the edge of a frozen world, pretending the ice could hold forever, pretending warmth could wait. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and I felt the distance of that winter stretch into the room, tangible, almost suffocating. His hands moved again, delicate, careful, as if touching the air could bring her back. "Her laugh," he said quietly. "Even in anger it carried through. I can still hear it." The tremor returned to his fingers, to his voice, a fragile testament to memory and longing. I wanted to reach for it, to touch it, to confirm that the past was still real. But memory cannot be grasped, only remembered. I traced my finger along the rim of the teacup again, letting the porcelain cool under my touch. I remembered every misstep, every argument, every pause in our conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time. And I realized how many moments I had mistaken for safety. How many times I had assumed the world would wait while we worked things out. Time, I understood now, had moved without permission. Distance had been final in ways I hadn't known to see. He exhaled, a quiet sound that filled the spaces between the words we had not spoken. "I never thought I would remember it like this," he said. "I never thought the last winter would feel so alive in memory, and yet so far." The words hovered, and I felt their weight pressing on me as though I had known them all along, had only ignored them. Outside, the wind stirred again, scattering leaves against the glass. The candle flickered in response, small and resilient. I felt a tremor in my own chest, a recognition that memory is heavier than absence, sharper than cold. And yet, it carries its own kind of warmth, the warmth of having loved, of having known, of having once shared a world with someone who leaves behind more than echoes. He looked at me then, fully this time, and for the first time I saw the reflection of that winter in his eyes. Not anger, not blame, only the quiet, unyielding weight of what had been lost and could never be replaced. I swallowed, letting the lump in my throat settle without sound. I realized that our shared memory had a shape now, fragile but undeniable. The candlelight trembled again, leaning slightly toward him. I let it be. The room held its breath with us. And for a long moment I did nothing but listen, to the wind, to the weight of memory, to the soft pulse of the flame. That winter had left her. And yet, through the fragments of our remembrance, she remained. In echoes, in tremors of voice and fingers, in the small, quiet flame that refused to die. And I wondered, how long before memory alone would be enough? The room felt smaller than before, though the walls hadn't moved. The candle on the windowsill flickered, bending toward him, as if curious about what he held. He reached into his coat slowly, fingers hesitating over the fabric. Outside, the wind rattled the edges of the old window, carrying a faint chill that pressed against the back of my neck. I didn't speak, only watched. Every movement of his hands seemed deliberate, careful, as though he feared breaking something invisible. He pulled something from his pocket, wrapped in a piece of worn cloth, small, soft, and familiar. My breath caught. The scent was faint, linen, faint traces of perfume, something that once clung to her hair. The object, unmistakably hers, rested in his hands like a fragile promise. I remembered it immediately, though I had tried not to. I had tried to forget. The air between us thickened. I didn't move. He didn't move. Even the candle seemed to pause, its flame trembling but steady, holding its light between us. I realized I hadn't known I was holding my breath until now. The house leaned in silently, as if listening, as if weighing the small history now returned to the room. I watched his fingers brush over the cloth, tracing its edges, its folds, tender as if the memory it carried demanded reverence. She gave this to me, he said softly, voice almost swallowed by the quiet. I could feel the weight of his words pressing against my chest. It was not an accusation. It was not explanation. It was simply the truth, laid bare in the tremor of his voice. I stared at him, at the way he held it like holding a fragment of the past too heavy to release. I thought of her, her small hands pressing it into his, the quiet smile she had offered him, the secret that had never reached me. I wanted to speak, to demand an answer, but the words lodged in my throat. They felt too fragile, too loud, too unnecessary. I had known loss, but this was something else. This was the weight of what I had not been given. He shifted slightly, a soft creak of the floor beneath him. I didn't ask for it, he whispered, almost to himself. I swear I didn't. She just. His words faltered. Understood. This was not his story alone. It was hers. And it had chosen him in ways I could not control. The candlelight flickered across his face, and I saw the faintest shadow of guilt, or perhaps reverence, in his eyes. He looked at me then, finally, but not fully. Not as if trying to explain. Only as if sharing something too delicate for speech. I wanted to take it from him, to hold it, to make it mine. But the moment held me still. The cloth shifted in his hands. Inside, the object was worn, edges softened by time and touch. I could imagine her hands holding it before, pressing it into his with quiet insistence. I could imagine her smile, almost imperceptible, almost hidden, just for him. Why had she done that? Why had she given it to him and not to me? He spoke again, slowly, deliberately, choosing his words as if threading a needle. She wanted you to have it someday, he said. Not now. Not then. I swallowed, tasting the metallic weight of my own tears unshed. The words were not comforting. They were only more questions. Questions I had not been ready to hear. I stepped closer, drawn by the object, by the memory it carried. The flame bent slightly toward me, casting shadows that danced across the floor, across the walls, across the small lines of his face. I could see the tremble in his fingers, the quiet reverence, the way he held the past like a living thing. I could almost hear her voice again, soft, hesitant, a secret meant for a single pair of ears. The wind outside howled, scattering dry leaves against the windowpane. The candle flickered, throwing tiny patterns of light across the room, making the shadows sway as though they were listening too. I felt my own hands reach, almost unconsciously, but I stopped. The object remained with him, a small weight in his possession that carried more history than either of us could bear at once. I never thought I would have this, he murmured. Not for years. Not without knowing what it meant. His eyes lingered on it, then on me. I saw the fragility in his gaze, the careful balance of holding something sacred and resisting its pull. I realized he was carrying her memory, her choice, her trust, in ways I could not claim or contest. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken truths. I could hear the faint hum of the heater, the slow tick of the clock in the hall, the flutter of candlelight against the walls. Everything else, the past, the choices, the distance, condensed into this single room, this single fragile object held in trembling hands. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to demand explanation. But I didn't. I let the pause hold its space, honoring the weight he carried. He lowered the cloth slightly, revealing just enough to catch the light. The object, worn and intimate, seemed to pulse with memory. I could see her touch in every crease, every soft edge. I could see the small, careful gesture of her deciding, for reasons I would never know, to give it to him and not me. And I understood suddenly that some acts of love, of trust, of choice, are not meant to be shared evenly. They are meant to linger in pockets, in hands, in the quiet space between people. I watched him fold the cloth carefully, returning the object to its small, protective layer. The candle bent toward the glow again, steady now, patient. His hands trembled as he slid it back into his pocket, the weight of it settling against him. I could feel the history, the absence, the small ache that accompanied its presence. I didn't speak. I only nodded, the small gesture heavy with acknowledgement. The wind outside rattled the window again, sharp and insistent. The flame flickered once, twice, and held its light. And I realized that memory, small, worn, carried in quiet hands, can speak louder than any question ever asked. The room exhaled with us. He exhaled. And for the first time I felt the weight of what she had given, and what I had been waiting for, finally settle between us. We stood there, two figures bound by absence and by the fragile glow of the candle, letting the history live for a moment, unspoken, untouchable, unforgettable. And I wondered, what other pieces of her life had been kept, carried quietly, waiting for the right moment to appear. The light from the candle stretched long shadows across the floor. Outside, the wind rattled the old window pane, carrying the faint scent of winter frost. He sat across from me, coat still damp from the night air, hands folded loosely in his lap. The object he had carried earlier rested beside him now, wrapped quietly in its cloth. The room felt heavy with memory, with absence, with the small weight of all that had been left unsaid. I didn't move, only listened. He began slowly, almost hesitant, choosing his words as if measuring their weight. There were nights, he said softly, nights spent moving, hiding, waiting. His voice was calm, quiet, but it carried the tremor of experience, of responsibility. I could picture her then, small and strong, weaving through darkness, relying on him in ways I had never known. He did not embellish, did not dramatize. He only laid out the road they had walked together, uneven, shadowed, uncertain. And I felt that same road stretch between us now, impossible to cross, yet intimate in its quiet revelation. The wind outside pressed against the walls, cold and persistent, while inside, the air felt charged, heavy with things remembered. He described the moments when she had trusted him, moments when trust was rare, when it was almost impossible to give. She never hesitated, he said, voice low, even when the world seemed ready to fold around her. She just moved. I felt a lump rise in my throat, not from fear but from awe. I had always known my daughter was brave, but this was a bravery measured in silence, in restraint, in quiet courage that went unseen. I reached for the edge of the table, fingernails brushing the worn wood, grounding myself in the present. He paused, looking at the candle as if it could illuminate the truth better than his words. I noticed the way the light played across his face, revealing lines of care, moments of hesitation, and the small tremor of hands that had held more than I could imagine. She trusted me, he continued, in ways I wasn't ready for. I think she knew I needed her trust as much as she needed someone to rely on. The weight of that struck me in silence. I realized I had always assumed I had been the one keeping her safe. And now, in the quiet room, I understood she had carried me too without knowing it. I listened as he described nights filled with shadows, rooms that weren't safe, streets that weren't friendly, hours that stretched endlessly under watchful eyes. He spoke with calm certainty, as if stating a fact, not a story. She never complained, he said, voice almost reverent. She just endured. She just kept going. I thought of all the times I had scolded her for small things, for minor rebellions, for words spoken too boldly. I had never seen the full scope of her strength. And now, hearing it unfold in quiet fragments, I felt both pride and regret in equal measure. Pride for the courage she had always carried. Regret for the moments I had failed to notice it. The candlelight flickered, and for a moment, I could imagine the streets she had walked, the darkness she had navigated, the small, precise steps that kept her safe. I felt her presence between us, intangible but undeniable, like the warmth of the candle despite the cold pressing in at the windows. He spoke of her decisions, not with praise, not with embellishment, but with quiet acknowledgement. She did what needed to be done, he said, without fanfare, without hesitation. I felt tears rise, but they did not fall. They hovered, delicate and weighty, unspoken. I did not need him to tell me she was brave. I needed him to confirm that I had seen only a fraction of the truth. He leaned slightly forward, eyes focused on some point behind me, as if looking through time itself. "There were moments," he said, "when I wondered if she understood how dangerous it was. If she even realized what she carried in her own hands." I felt my chest tighten. Had I underestimated her? Had I mistaken quiet compliance for weakness? I thought of the small everyday moments I had shared with her. The laughter, the tears, the arguments, and how they seemed insignificant against the scale of what she had endured. He reached into his pocket, briefly, fingers brushing the worn cloth again. "I never wanted to put her in harm's way," he said, voice gentle, almost fragile. "But she carried herself through it anyway. Stronger than I ever imagined." I swallowed, letting the words settle. They were not about him. They were about her. And yet, I felt them reverberate through the room, through the spaces of memory and absence, and through the small, aching places I hadn't known were there. The candle trembled in the draught, shadows stretching across the walls, across the worn floor, across the distance between us. I realized then that the road between us, between him, her, and me, was not just physical. It was made of memory, trust, courage, absence, and all the small decisions that go unnoticed until someone recounts them aloud. He did not seek to replace me. He did not seek to claim her. He simply told the story she had entrusted him with. And I, for the first time, felt the weight of her choices, her strength, her trust, in the silence that followed. I exhaled slowly, letting the breath fill the room, mingling with the faint warmth of the candle. I thought of her, young and determined, quiet yet unyielding, moving through nights and shadows with a confidence I had never fully recognized. Had she been braver than I ever knew? Had she understood the risks better than I ever could? And had I, in my distance, allowed her to carry more than I had realized? The wind outside stilled, leaving only the quiet hum of the house and the soft glow of the candle. He lowered his gaze, resting hands lightly on his knees, and the small tremor in his fingers mirrored my own, shared across space and memory. We both sat there, two witnesses to a story larger than either of us could hold alone. And for a long moment, nothing needed to be said. I watched the shadows dance across the walls, imagining the small steps she had taken, the nights she had endured, the trust she had placed in him. And I realized that strength is not always loud. It is quiet, persistent. It moves through people, leaving marks, carrying stories, building bridges across distance and absence. The candle flickered once more, steadying. I felt the weight of memory settle softly between us. He exhaled, and for the first time I understood she had trusted. She had endured. She had been braver than I could have imagined. And the road between us, the road between him, her, and me, stretched quietly, patiently, waiting for the next step. The candle trembled softly on the windowsill, its light brushing the edges of the worn curtains. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, whispering secrets the house had long kept. He sat across from me, still and careful, hands resting on his knees as if the world might tip if he moved too quickly. The room held its breath with us. Everything smelled faintly of old wood, wax, and winter cold. I could feel the weight of his presence, quiet, deliberate, and the weight of her absence, heavier still. I didn't speak. I only listened. His voice came next, low, measured, like someone choosing stones to cross a stream. I don't know where she is now," he said softly. "I only know where she has been." The words landed gently, but they carried the pull of 1,000 unasked questions. The candle flickered again, shadows bending across the floor like they wanted to hear more. I watched him, searching for hesitation or guilt, but found only truth, small, unadorned, and entirely his to offer. I realized, with a quiet ache, that understanding did not always arrive wrapped in answers. The room was still. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and uncertain, echoing against the walls. The chair beneath me creaked faintly, like it remembered the moments of our lives long before tonight. I thought of her, of the life she had chosen or been forced into, of the road she had walked unseen. And I felt the distance between us between now and then, stretched like a thin thread ready to snap. He didn't try to fill the gaps. He didn't pretend the story was complete. He only spoke what he knew, and somehow that was enough. I reached for the edge of the table, fingers brushing the polished wood, grounding myself in the present. He spoke again, quieter now, voice almost a whisper. She trusted me to carry what she needed me to, he said. And I carried it as best I could. His eyes lingered on the candlelight, reflecting it in a way that made it seem alive, attentive. I thought of all the times I had worried, all the times I had imagined, all the times I had needed her presence, her words, her touch, and realized that sometimes care is expressed in what is carried quietly, unseen. The candle flickered, throwing moving shadows across the walls, across the floor, across the space between us. I imagined her in those spaces, small and determined, leaving traces only he could follow. I wondered if she thought of me, or if the thought was a distant comfort, a memory of warmth she no longer carried. He did not offer comfort, nor did I seek it. I only felt the truth settle, heavy and insistent, like the quiet after snow has fallen. The room seemed to hold the moment with us, patient, unhurried, aware of the fragile equilibrium between what is known and what is left behind. His hands shifted in his lap, a subtle motion that drew my eyes. They trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of memory. He had carried her presence for longer than I could imagine. Her trust folded carefully into his own life, small as a candle flame against the darkness. I wanted to ask where she had gone, what she had done, who she had become, but the questions felt intrusive, impatient. He had given me something more important. Her truth, her existence, preserved in his hands, in his voice, in the quiet space between us. I exhaled slowly, letting the breath fill the room, mixing with the faint scent of wax and wood. I realized that understanding can exist without closure. The candle leaned toward us, steady now, gentle, as if acknowledging the revelation without demanding more. I could feel the house listening, the floorboards remembering, the walls keeping their own silent counsel. And I knew that some truths are meant to linger, not to resolve. They stay, soft and persistent, shaping us quietly, reminding us of what we have loved, what we have lost, and what we have carried ourselves. The wind outside softened, leaving only the distant hum of the night and the fragile warmth of the candle. He looked at me once, long and unflinching, and for a moment I saw not a stranger but a fellow witness. A fellow keeper of what had been entrusted. No explanations followed, no stories expanded. The silence was enough. I felt my own hands rest lightly in my lap, and I realized the weight of that quiet, the weight of knowing her through the fragments left behind. I thought of her smile, fleeting and luminous, and of her voice, soft and determined, echoing through memory. I thought of all the times I had imagined her gone forever, and all the times she had simply moved forward, leaving pieces of herself behind for those who could see. And in that candlelight, in that quiet room, I understood that truth does not demand answers, does not need explanation. It only requires witness, presence, and the willingness to let it live where it belongs. The candle flickered once, twice, then held steady. I felt the room exhale with us, settling into the stillness. He exhaled too, releasing some weight I did not see but could feel. I realized that what had stayed with me all these years, the longing, the absence, the questions, had softened, not vanished. Truth, I understood now, does not always resolve. It lingers, persistent as the light of a candle in the night, marking the space between what was and what remains. I stood, moving slowly toward the window, letting the faint winter air brush against my face. Outside, shadows stretched long and quiet, indifferent and patient. Inside, the candle remained, steadfast, as if bearing witness to everything we could not say. I turned to look at him, but he was already looking past me, as if seeing her in the spaces I could not reach. I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, heavy and quiet. The night pressed close, but the room felt alive with memory. I whispered her name under my breath, letting it ride the small gust of wind through the open window. It felt like a bridge across absence, across years, across questions that would never be answered. And I realized the truth: what had stayed was enough. It would carry us forward, silently, persistently, like the candlelight in the darkness. I looked back at him one last time. No words were needed. We both knew. Some truths remain unspoken, yet fully understood. The flame flickered gently, casting long, steady shadows across the walls. And I knew that tomorrow and every day after, her presence would linger in the quiet spaces of our lives, as it always had, and as it always would. The house was silent when the door closed behind him. The sound lingered in the hallway, soft but final, like a sigh pressing into the wood and walls. I stayed where I was, hands wrapped around the small bundle he had left, feeling its weight in the quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, scratching against the windowpane with a sound that was both familiar and foreign. The candle, which had burned so faithfully each night, remained unlit on the windowsill. For the first time in years, I did not reach for it. I let the darkness settle, letting my eyes adjust slowly, letting the shadows fill the room with their own quiet rhythm. I sank into the armchair by the fire, though the coals had long since gone cold. The room smelled faintly of wax, old wood, and winter air that had crept in unnoticed. I thought of all the nights I had lit that candle, each one a small act of remembrance, of waiting, of hope I couldn't name. I had not told anyone why I did it, and now, in the absence of the familiar flame, I wondered if I had ever really understood. Holding the object he had brought, I traced the worn cloth with my fingertips, feeling the history pressed into its folds. I remembered her laugh, the way her presence had filled the corners of this house, the way absence could weigh so heavily on every surface. Was this the end of the ritual, or the beginning of understanding it? I set the bundle on the table and leaned back, letting my mind drift. The floor creaked softly beneath me, a subtle reminder of years that had passed and memories that refused to settle. I thought of the nights I had spent waiting, the seasons that had changed outside this very window, the long, unbroken hours of silence punctuated only by my own breathing. I realized I had been holding on to more than the candle. I had been holding on to fear, longing, and the faint hope of knowing her again. But now, with him gone, with the house settled in stillness, I felt the space between remembrance and release begin to shift. The candle was no longer necessary to mark her presence. It had never been the light itself that mattered, but the act of remembering, quietly and deliberately. I ran my fingers over the bundle again, feeling the texture, the weight, the invisible story it carried. It was hers, unmistakably, yet not mine. And in that simple fact, I felt a strange relief. I had not failed. I had been given a witness instead, someone who had kept her presence alive in ways I could not have imagined. The darkness in the room seemed less oppressive now, softened by the knowledge that memory could exist without constant illumination. I did not need the candle to burn for me to know she had been here, and that she had entrusted pieces of herself to those she trusted. The flame had moved, not in wax or wick, but in the quiet spaces of memory and understanding. I traced the shadows on the wall, letting my eyes follow their subtle dance. The house felt different, lighter somehow, though the air still held the scent of old wood and years past. I thought of the road my daughter had walked, the trust she had given, and the bravery she had carried quietly, without fanfare. And I realized that the candle had been a bridge, not a destination. It had held me in its light, guided me through absence, and now, in its unlit state, it had completed its purpose. I did not feel loss. I felt something quieter. Acknowledgement, acceptance, a soft understanding that some rituals are not meant to continue forever. They are meant to teach, to carry, to move. I leaned back in the chair, eyes closing for a moment, letting the quiet stretch around me. The bundle on the table called softly to my memory, and I let myself remember her fully. The sound of her voice, the curve of her smile, the way she had moved through the world with both caution and courage. All of it pressed against my chest, but not in pain. In the darkness, the memories were free to breathe, to settle, to exist on their own terms. I understood that the flame I had lit nightly had never been hers. It had been mine. Mine to hold, mine to release, mine to let move beyond fear and waiting. I opened my eyes and reached for the window, pushing back the curtains slightly. The night was deep and still, the stars hidden by clouds that moved lazily across the sky. For a long moment I just looked, letting the quiet of the world outside mingle with the quiet inside. I felt the house around me, the walls, the floors, the corners where shadows lingered like memories of their own. It seemed to lean toward me, patient, aware, a witness to what I could not say aloud. I felt the candle's absence as presence. A paradox, perhaps, but one I understood instinctively. The flame had moved. It had shifted from wax to memory, from ritual to understanding, from hope to acknowledgement. I reached for the bundle once more, holding it close, feeling the contours of what had been entrusted to me. I whispered her name softly, and the sound felt like a bridge across the years, a quiet conversation between absence and presence, between what was held and what was free. The house seemed to breathe with me, the floorboards settling, the walls absorbing, the shadows keeping their own counsel. I felt an unspoken promise in that moment, to remember without clinging, to honor without control, to let the light, whatever form it took, move naturally, persistently, gently. I did not relight the candle that night. I did not need to. I let the darkness stretch, letting the room hold the memories, the quiet, the understanding that had come slowly, deliberately, and finally. The house was no longer merely a vessel for waiting. It had become a space for holding, for witnessing, for releasing. I sat in that darkness, holding what he had brought, and felt the ritual's meaning shift into something alive and quiet. The flame had moved, indeed. Not extinguished, not forgotten, but transformed. And for the first time in many nights, I felt the weight of absence softened by presence. Not hers, not his, but mine. I exhaled slowly, letting the air fill the room and settle. I realized then that letting go was not forgetting. It was trusting the light to find its own path, trusting memory to do its work, and trusting myself to hold what needed to be held, and release what needed to move. I rose and moved to the window again, letting the night air brush my face. The house creaked gently behind me, and I imagined her somewhere out there, moving, living, unseen but persistent. The candle remained dark, yet somehow, in the quiet, it burned brighter than ever. I understood at last. Letting the flame move was never about the wax, the wick, or the light. It was about acceptance, remembrance, and the soft, enduring truth that some things are meant to guide us, not remain with us forever. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of memory, the presence of absence, the light that moves quietly through all that we hold dear. And I waited patiently for the next chapter of knowing, trusting, and letting go. The first light of morning slipped into the room, pale and uninvited, brushing the corners like a quiet visitor. It fell on the floorboards, revealing dust motes dancing slowly in the cold air. I sat at the edge of the bed, shoulders heavy, hands resting on the quilt he had brought. The candle sat unlit on the windowsill, a silent witness to all that had passed. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint chill that pressed against the glass. I could hear birds beginning their quiet calls somewhere beyond the trees, tentative and unhurried. The world had begun again without asking if I was ready. I rose slowly, feet finding the floor with familiar creaks. The room smelled faintly of winter, wax, and something older, a memory tucked into the corners. I moved to the window, sliding it open just enough for the cold air to enter. It brushed my face, sharp and honest, carrying the scent of frost and early morning streets. I breathed it in deeply, letting it fill the empty spaces in my chest. For the first time in a long while, absence did not feel like erasure. I thought of her, of the road she had walked, the strength she had carried quietly, and the moment she had entrusted to someone else when I could not. I rested my hands on the sill, feeling the texture of the wood beneath my palms. The house, which had once felt heavy with unspoken things, seemed to hold its breath along with me. I traced the shapes of the shadows cast by the soft morning light, noticing how they curved, softened, and shifted as the sun climbed higher. The quilt lay folded nearby, warm with memory, a small gift from him that carried more than fabric. It carried trust and the invisible thread of her presence. I let my eyes drift across the room, over walls that had kept secrets, over floors that remembered each creak and sigh, and over the furniture that bore silent witness to years of waiting. It was quiet, but not lonely. It was still, but not empty. I thought back to the nights I had lit the candle, one after another, each flame a marker of time, a plea to remember, a quiet prayer that she might return or that I might understand. Now, in the morning light, I realized the candle had always been a bridge, never the end. It had held me in place, yes, but it had also taught me how to let go. I ran my fingers along the folds of the quilt again, imagining her laughter echoing softly somewhere far away, and I felt a strange, gentle release. Could remembering finally mean moving forward? I wasn't sure, but the thought no longer scared me. I stepped back from the window and let the chill settle in my bones, letting the sensation anchor me in the present. The house seemed lighter now, less a keeper of secrets and more a companion to my reflection. I noticed the way the light pooled across the floor, pooling in the spaces where the shadows had once held me captive. It was ordinary, yet extraordinary, the way morning could arrive without ceremony, without permission, and still bring clarity. I realized that absence had a shape, a presence of its own, and that I could hold it without being crushed. The moments of silence I had endured were not emptiness. They were the threads that wove me into understanding, patience, and quiet acceptance. I moved toward the kitchen, the floorboards murmuring beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of frost and the lingering candle wax. I set the bundle he had brought carefully on the table, looking at it as one might a small miracle. It seemed heavier now, not in weight but in meaning. I could feel her in it, in the quiet folds, in the invisible lines connecting memory to presence. I thought of the nights of fear, the long pauses, the stories he had told, the winter she had left, and all the roads they had walked together. The weight of the past remained, but it felt different. Not threatening, not heavy, just held. I paused by the window again, listening to the morning slowly unfold outside. The air moved gently through the branches, a soft rustle that reminded me of whispered secrets. The sun climbed, illuminating the frost on the rooftops, the tips of trees, the quiet streets where life had begun again. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it all wash over me. The cold, the light, the memories, the absence, the presence. A sense of peace had settled in the spaces where fear had once lingered. I was not alone in the house, nor in the memories, nor in the absence that had once felt unbearable. I opened my eyes and looked at the candle on the windowsill. Its unlit wick no longer carried the weight of expectation. I understood at last that it had served its purpose, not as a marker of hope or longing, but as a guide to help me carry the memory, the love, and the presence of someone I could no longer see. The flame had moved, just as it had in the quiet nights before, transforming into understanding, into acceptance, into something enduring. I reached out and let the sunlight brush my fingers, feeling warmth without fire, presence without flame. The house, the room, the morning, everything was quietly alive, and I was part of it. I moved back to the armchair, sitting slowly, letting the quilt drape over my shoulders. The world outside was waking, and so was I, in a way I had not been able to for years. The absence of fear, the absence of waiting, the absence of despair. It was a new kind of presence, subtle, patient, gentle. I let the light fill me, and in that light I felt her. The memory of her strength, her laughter, her trust, and the quiet truth of what she had carried with her. The morning had arrived without asking, and I had opened myself to it without hesitation. I breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill my lungs and the warmth of memory fill my chest. The house had listened, the candle had guided, the stranger had carried, and now I could sit, finally, without fear. The flame had moved beyond wax, beyond wick, beyond ritual. It was in memory, in acceptance, in the quiet knowledge that absence could hold presence, and presence could be remembered without burning endlessly. I whispered her name softly, and the sound seemed to linger, blending with the morning light, the chill, and the awakening world outside. I rose, moving to the window one last time, letting the wind brush my face. The branches swayed gently, the sky lightened, and the world moved forward without asking. I did not need the candle anymore. I did not need to wait. I could remember, I could release, and I could begin again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet truth of morning without fear. The sun climbed higher, and I stayed at the window, letting the light fill every corner, letting the past settle without pressing down. Somewhere out there she moved, she lived, she existed beyond absence and memory. And I, in the stillness of the house, in the warmth of the quilt, in the gentle clarity of dawn, began to move forward too. The day had arrived, and with it, the possibility of peace. I breathed in, exhaled slowly, and let the morning hold me. The flame had moved, and I was ready to follow.